So, today I'm upgrading a budget PC I made a little while ago, and it's actually my main system that I use for editing and just everyday stuff. It's running an i5-10400F with 16GB of DDR4 RAM, and originally it had an Intel A380 in here, but it kept crashing and I'm pretty sure it was down to the driver issues more than anything else. But now I've swapped the A380 with a GTX 1070, and the crashes have completely stopped. Now that we have everything running properly, let's see how it performs in a few games. The first game is Assassin's Creed Rogue, running at 1440p on very high settings with motion blur turned off and FXAA enabled. In this system, the GTX 1070 actually holds up pretty well, especially for a decade-old graphics card. The 1070 launched way back on June the 10th, 2016. It was built on NVIDIA's Pascal architecture and packed 8GB of DDR5 memory. Even today it still holds up. In a lot of games you can expect a solid overall experience, especially at 1080p, where high settings are often no problem. And for more demanding titles, just dialing a few settings back can keep things running smoothly, without sacrificing too much visual quality.
The HMS Pembroke.
In terms of performance, Assassin's Creed Rogue delivers an average of 61 FPS, with a 1% low of 54 and a 0.1% low of 45 FPS. Next up is Atomfall, running at 1440p resolution on low graphics settings with motion blur turned off. The GTX 1070 can still run things pretty smoothly, especially if you're using moderate settings. And if you don't mind tweaking a few options, like turning down shadows or post-processing, you can get a really solid, consistent experience. One big plus is the 8GB of VRAM. Some might say in 2026 this is not enough, but I beg to differ. It still holds up pretty well at 1440p, and even newer games like Atomfall should be playable at that resolution. As long as you're okay with making a few compromises, it's all about finding that balance between visuals and performance. So yeah, it's not exactly future-proof anymore, but it's definitely not outdated either. When it comes to performance, Atomfall is averaging 95 FPS, with lows at 80 for the 1% and 75 for the 0.1%. The next game is Fortnite, running at 2160p on low graphics settings with motion blur turned off and FXAA enabled. In esports games, performance is honestly more than fine. It's not about pushing the graphics to the highest settings. So, if the 1070 is hitting over 100 FPS at 4K resolution in Fortnite, well then, that's exactly where you want it to be. A lot of players even deliberately lower their settings. It can make enemies easier to spot, and it can also help keep performance stable when things get intense. The last thing you want is your FPS dropping in the middle of a fight. So, when I said it's fine earlier, what I really mean is it delivers the kind of smooth, reliable performance that actually matters in games like this. For example, in Fortnite, it averages 139 FPS, with a 1% low of 63 and a 0.1% low of 45. Next up is High on Life 2, running at 1080p on low settings, with motion blur turned off and AMD FSR3 set to ultra performance. That means it's actually been upscaled from around 640 by 360, basically 360p. I mean, the game actually looks good to play like this. 8GB of VRAM on the 1070 isn't a lot by today's standards. A lot of people will tell you that 8GB just isn't enough anymore, and in some cases, especially with Unreal Engine 5 games, they're technically right. But what's interesting here is that the game is actually pretty well optimised. So even running on hardware like this, you can still play it in this kind of setup, and genuinely have a good experience without it falling apart. On average, the game delivers 86 FPS, with a 1% low of 52 and a 0.1% low of 22 FPS. Next up is Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, running at 1080p resolution on medium graphics settings, with depth of field and motion blur turned off and AMD FSR3 set to balanced. If you're looking at the used GPU market in 2026, the GTX 1070 is everywhere. The big reason why people still buy it is the price. On the UK used market, it usually sits at about £70, which is roughly about $50 in the US. It's still one of the cheapest ways to get a dedicated gaming GPU that can handle some decent 1080p gaming. In Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, the GTX 1070 averages 78 FPS with a 1% low of 43 and a 0.1% low of 7 FPS. Despite those dips, it shows that well-optimized titles can run surprisingly well on this card, even in 2026. Next up, we've got Resident Evil Requiem, running at 1080p with the settings on low. Motion blur is enabled and AMD FSR3 is set to performance. If you're still using a 1070 in 2026, then there's a couple of key features you're missing out on: ray tracing and DLSS. First, ray tracing. The 1070 doesn't have that special hardware needed to handle real-time lighting effects, so it simply can't run it. Then there's DLSS, NVIDIA's AI upscaling. And again, the 1070 can't use it because it doesn't have the required cores. So, you really start to notice the difference in games like Resident Evil Requiem. Newer graphics cards can deliver sharper visuals, better lighting and smoother performance all at once. Meanwhile, the 1070 has to rely on older methods, which makes it harder to get that same balance. It doesn't mean the card is unusable, but it does mean you're missing out on features that are shaping modern gaming today. And don't forget that gap will only get bigger over time. In Resident Evil Requiem, performance is impressively solid for a new release. The game averages 111 FPS with 1% lows of 48 and 0.1% lows dipping to 21 FPS. Next up is The Outer Worlds 2, running at 1080p on low settings. Motion blur is turned off and AMD FSI set to ultra performance. The GTX 1070 is old, but it's still good for a server-type setup. That's because it comes with a few decent codecs, which can handle video encoding and decoding without putting too much strain on the CPU. For home servers running Plex, this makes a big difference. You can get smooth real-time transcoding across multiple devices, even at 4K. So, while it may be slowly coming outdated for modern gaming features, the 1070 still holds real value as a capable media server GPU. In The Outer Worlds 2, performance isn't that bad, especially with the game being upscaled from 360p. It averages 53 FPS with a 1% low of 37 FPS, and a 0.1% low dipping to 20 FPS. Finally, we've got The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt running at 1080p on medium settings, with depth of field and motion blur turned off, and AMD FSR2 set to quality. With this budget system, the game averages 64 FPS, with a 1% low of 43 and a 0.1% low of 36 FPS.
Fuck.
Now, was it worth upgrading my budget PC with a GTX 1070? Overall, yes. Swapping out the original GPU for a 1070 turned out to be a decent upgrade. The biggest win was consistency. The system stopped crashing completely, which already makes the change worth it on its own. Now in 2026, it's actually capable of solid 1080p gaming, and can even stretch into 1440p, with of course adjusted settings. So, was it worth it in a budget context? Absolutely. The GTX 1070 still delivers strong value on the used market. But don't forget, it's also a temporary solution, not a future-proof upgrade. It's the kind of card that works well today, as long as you understand what you're working with. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this look back at the GTX 1070 in a budget second-hand build, then you're going to love the next video, because we're going all the way back to 2007 to see how Crysis runs on a true time capsule setup. So, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm David James, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one.